Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and this week's contract tip has to do with earnest money and how you address it in the termination and release if the buyer terminates the contract prior to their obligation of having to remit the funds to the holder. So as you know, when you are drafting a contract and negotiating a contract, there is a provision where the buyer and the seller may negotiate for the time frame within which the buyer is to remit the earnest money to the holder. It says something, there are various choices. One choice is buyer has remitted the earnest money, and that means you as the agent have the earnest money in hand when you are drafting the contract. The second option is buyer to remit earnest money to holder X number of days after binding agreement date. So we are pretty much seeing that option in the majority of contracts that come across, where the buyer is not, the agent does not have the earnest money in their possession when they are drafting the contract, negotiating the contract. Here's my silly pup. And so the buyer is due to, the obligation is for the buyer to send the funds in to the holder within so many days after the buyer and the seller have a binding contract. So let's say that's the option that was chosen, and then the buyer terminates the contract perhaps under the due diligence period prior, and let's say they terminate the contract prior to the time frame where they were obligated to even send the funds into the holder. What do you do when filling out the termination and release? Well, as our compliance broker, Dawn Southern, states, if earnest money is addressed in the creation of a contract, earnest money must also be addressed in the termination of a contract. So regardless of where those funds are in the remittance process, you still must address it in the release portion of the termination and release. So as you know, it only takes one party to terminate a contract. However, it takes both the buyer and the seller's agreement regarding the disbursement of those funds upon termination. So you still have to, like I said, regardless of where they are in the remittance, they are still a part of the contract, and they are still there's still potentially a claim to those funds had the buyer, for example, terminated by default. So basically, you know, there could be a time when a buyer was not due to remit the funds until a certain number of days after binding agreement date, but did not go binding with a due diligence or buyer's right to terminate period. In that instance, if the buyer terminated, the buyer would be potentially in default and the seller would have a claim to the funds. So that's why you must address it and get both buyer and seller's signatures on the agreement to release. So all you do, if you go binding under a GAR contract, then in the termination and release, and that form is GAR F83, the termination and release agreement, and it handles both the termination of the contract and the agreement to disperse the trust funds in one document. And on that form, under the release portion, you simply reference where the parties had agreed to the remittance. So you would put buyer to retain earnest money, not yet remitted, per paragraph A7B. And then if you go binding under the RE forms contract, there are two documents that you need when you are terminating a contract. The first one is the notice to withdraw or terminate the contract. In the RE forms, that's RE 263. So you only need one signature there because it's a notice, and you send that. But then you need the other document, which is RE 212, agreement to disperse trust funds, and agreement indicates you need both party signatures. So in that document, if you go binding under the RE forms, same thing, you put buyer to retain earnest money, not yet remitted, per paragraph 3.1 of binding agreement. Hope that helps. Thank you so much for watching. Again, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs for service, innovation, and education.